it when we're going to be talking about it. I know this has been a very hot and busy week. Oof. I hope everybody's air conditioning is working. That's pretty much all I can say, because it has been incredibly warm. It's been a long 10 days, for that matter, with a holiday in between. Since last Sunday, Pastor Craig has been at a wedding, Layla and Shannon's, and a funeral for his Aunt Carol, and we've all been trying to stay cool in this really horrible heat wave. This is the last week of talking about This Is Us as a theme, and next week we bridge to Who Do You Think You Are? But if you've been following what we've been talking about and calling things in the last weeks, you've noticed that we've been talking about different ways to be us by using words like everybody, somebody, and now we got back to us in between. I left out that last us because it seemed like too much to me. We have a unique opportunity this summer to figure out what God is calling us to do. I want to thank Dorothy while I'm right here for filling in today for us, because one of the things we're figuring out is how do we do things as far as music and worship going forward. And we've been using all kinds of people to figure that out. And Carla will be back with us next week, and she has graciously agreed to be the rest of our summer person for sure. And after that, we'll find out where things go. But for now, we're figuring out who is us and where are we going. In today's part of the letter of Paul to the Church of Corinth, I'll admit that some of it is really confusing. I am not going to be digging deeply into what caught outside the body might mean, and much about there being more than one heaven. I can give you a postage stamp on that one. In the Hebrew belief, there were 3 heavens, but they were not heavens like we think of as going to heaven to be with Jesus. The first heaven was the sky over us. The second heaven was what we call outer space. The third heaven was where God lived. And so what Paul is saying, that he or this person had been given a chance to look at into and be into for a moment that third heaven. And even though Paul says, I know a person, we pretty much believe he was talking about himself. But in order to keep from him boasting about that or feeling special about it, he says he's been given a thorn in the flesh. We don't know exactly what that is either, just that in some physical or emotional way, he's been given an ongoing challenge. There are all kinds of possibilities to what that challenge could have been, because Paul never tells us for sure. Guesses have been epilepsy or some kind of chronic health problem, a speech impediment, but honestly, does it matter? In much lesser form, we've all been given our challenges of some kind because, like we said that first week, nobody's perfect. Paul says that because he has weaknesses, God can demonstrate God's perfect power and grace even better in followers like Paul who have weaknesses. Only God is perfect, and that's okay. Even God, in perfection, chose to be part of this imperfect world. And today's gospel points out what a challenge that was for God. Jesus comes back to his hometown, and he gets nothing but grief. Instead of welcoming him and saying, hey, that's our hometown boy, he's done good. Well, instead, he gets no respect. Wow, who's this? Isn't this just the carpenter? And how did he get all this power? They're not holding him up as a good thing at all. They're just saying, well, where did he get all this? How did this handyman get the knowledge to teach with authority in the synagogue? It's hard to see Jesus for what he is when we think about his human form and family. Here in Nazareth, he's got brothers and sisters and a mom and a past. But we tend to look at the future, where he is going. And we go on from there when we think about Jesus. But today, we're in that in between a carpenter and a Messiah. in between God as us and God with us. And it's a tough place to be. But the church is called to be in tough places. And today's gospel, Jesus starts that call and basically is teaching his disciples how to be church. He goes directly from his lukewarm welcome in Nazareth to showing the 12 what they needed to do. He told them to travel light and fast, and he gave them authority to really do stuff when they set out. As a result, they got the important news to people, that God's kingdom is right here and right now, that God has the power to cast out demons and heal us, and God is willing to share that power with us through Jesus Christ. So how do we keep doing that? Fortunately, in some ways, we're not in the same situation as the 12 were then. We're still the church, though, and we need ways to figure out how to be people that God calls us to be. We can share the good news with each other to keep going and to keep being church. And this week, I learned a lot from Bob. Now, if you were here a few weeks ago, Pastor Craig told a great story about Bob a few weeks ago. Just a regular guy who was a lawyer and a follower of Jesus, but he wanted to do more, to figure out what God was calling him specifically to do. He asked a friend and got an idea to pray for a specific place. They settled on Uganda for 30 days. And Bob had never been to Uganda, but he agreed to pray for Uganda for 30 days. Well, that was a few years ago. Bob's name is Bob Goff, and he is the honorary consul in the U.S. for Uganda now, and the head of a really awesome nonprofit called Love Does, that builds schools and other places for kids in war zones, among other things. He lives in San Diego. He travels all over the world, and he's written 2 books. The first about Love Does, which is that nonprofit that he runs, and the third, which was the second, but the second never got published because, long story short, somebody stole his computer. The third that came out recently is called Everybody, Always. There was a second book in between the two that was finished and ready to be published, but something happened. Somebody stole his computer, and the book disappeared, and he hadn't backed it up. So he spent a couple years working on this one instead, about how to become love. Bob loves Jesus. He's not a whole huge amount about organized religion and denominations and stuff like that. For Bob, following Jesus is all about love. Jesus calls us to love everybody, always. That's where he gets the title of the book. No excuses, no reasons why we can't, just love. And, Bob agrees that it's easy to love our friends and our family. But God calls us to go a whole bunch deeper than that, to get in between, to love our enemies, the ones that are difficult and aggravating, and as he calls them, the creepy people that Jesus would have hung out with, but we'd rather not. And sometimes he admits they're even evil or hate-filled people, but God still calls us to love them. I was really enthralled with Pastor's story about Bob the other week. And I got to tell you, after reading his books, praying for Uganda was just the start. Bob has been on an incredible journey for impossible things, and he keeps doing them. He's been doing them for years. If you think some of Paul's adventures are wild, you'll love Bob. If you think in 200 pages, he tells us about becoming love. That's what he calls it. Following Jesus is becoming love. Not just doing love or acting in love, becoming love. It's not easy. It may be simple, but it's definitely not easy. But Jesus never promised us easy. He promised us that he'll always be with us, and his instructions are simple. Love God, love your neighbors, all of them, all the time. Bob talks about ways we can do that, and he has some simple but deep things to say. He also, as I've told a couple people this morning already, puts his email address and his cell phone number in the back of his books. And I can tell you he answers email very quickly, because when I finished reading his book this week, I wanted to share it today. But obviously, I can't share a whole book. Well, I could, but we'd be here forever. I started taking out one important idea from each of the 25 chapters. Then I cut out the long, complicated ones. Then I boiled it down to 5. And I emailed Bob and asked if I could use them. And he said yes. And those are the yellow sheets that Marianne and Terry passed out. And you'll find them and you can share them around with the folks around you. Love everybody, always. That's fairly self-explanatory. Be not afraid. Bob points out, as some of us up here have pointed out, that those are some of the most common instructions in the Bible. Just keep doing things. Even if you're afraid, keep doing it anyway. It's not about me. When he goes into detail on that one, he explains, if it's about me, it's not going to be about Jesus. If I step out of the way, life, whatever, can be about Jesus when it's not about me. Extravagant love is never wasted. So loving extravagantly, that father going to the prodigal son kind of extravagant love, will never be wasted. Poured out on someone, even your worst enemy, it does what God calls us to do. Everybody goes to our church. He has a great story in a whole bunch of churches coming together for what he mistakenly heard as being invited to go to a croc drop. He was looking forward to this, people are going to be dropping crocodiles. When he got there, it was a warehouse full of potatoes. And it was a crop drop, where folks were gleaning fields of potatoes and sharing them with the poor and the hungry. But there were probably 10 or 20 different congregations involved. And he noticed that everybody in there was just saying, our church. And he said, that's the way it ought to be. Everybody goes to our church because there's only one church, God's church. So we may go to a little congregation called New Hope, but everybody goes to our church. The bottom line, what I boil down, is a profound statement. Loving people the way Jesus does either changes everything in us or it changes nothing. Think about that one. Loving people the way Jesus does either changes everything in us or it changes nothing. I want you to, I'm going to do one of those Pastor Nikki things again. Talk about what you think this phrase means for 2 minutes. Just only 2 minutes, and I will keep track. But find a group near you, hopefully not all family. Add at least one person in who isn't your family. And talk about this. What does loving people the way Jesus mean? It changes everything or nothing. Go. You've got 30 seconds to wrap it up. Whoever's talking right now can wrap up their sentence. Pardon me? It doesn't make sense? Why does that not make sense? Why? Right. If it doesn't change everything that you're doing, nothing changes. Well, there are people who can say, oh, I can do this and still be a Christian because I don't only have to give this part of what I am to Jesus. It doesn't have to change everything I do. But yeah, it's an all or nothing. Okay. At least we got conversation going. Yeah. And welcome to our newlyweds. I mentioned you at the beginning of things. Yay! So, anybody got a... This group said, I don't get it, because they were arguing exactly what Bob was actually. If loving Jesus doesn't change everything in your life, you're not doing it. Yeah, you're not following Jesus. But it's not easy. Anybody else have something to think about that, to say about that? Yeah, Terry.
I think even if in our weaknesses and the fact that we are a work in progress, that we believe changes everything we see. We even look at our weaknesses differently, Mrs. Baldwin. So to me, as soon as you believe, it gives you an understanding, even looking at our sin and our failure.
Right. Like Terry said, once we believe, even looking at our weaknesses, our everything is different because we belong to Christ. And that just that alone has to change everything. Yeah.
Well, you said it's a high mark to me because it says the way Jesus does.
Yes, the way Jesus
you're not
does.
doing that, and so you just do what you can to get outside you to be everything for him.
Exactly. Loving the way Jesus does is a challenge because it's a radical way to love. It's a radical way to live your life. And it's not easy to do that. So, how do we do that? Maybe we just start this way, by talking and listening, and then we act on that love. That's how we figure out who we think we are. And we'll start diving into that next week. Amen.